All of us will turn another year older this year. Have you noticed that birthdays kind of work like they keep getting bigger in number? They don't go the other way. We all are getting older. It's important for us to recognize what God says about our lives and how quickly they end. I don't want anyone to interpret this morning as me saying that if you're elderly, you are worthless. By no means am I saying that. But it is important for us to recognize that life is kind of like a plate spinner. I saw one time. He had about 12 of them going and would have a big pole. He had 12 poles and plates. He just spun the plates and stuck them up there, right? And it's amazing how quickly they start to wobble, and then he'd go and spin one. And then isn't life a lot like that? We're trying to keep so many things going. And when we're younger, it's something that we tend to have more of because, for various reasons, we have more responsibilities, perhaps because of raising children, that kind of thing. There are more things, more opportunities for us. And as we age, we tend to pull ourselves out of some of those things, or by nature, those kinds of things happen. We're not as involved. The lessons are still the same, and they still have the same kind of techniques for the elderly as the young, as far as I can see. We still have to spin plates, but the temptation is when we're younger that we spin a lot more plates maybe than we should. And that's really what this lesson is about, because there's so many times, instead of letting God tell us what plates we should be spinning, we let the Joneses tell us what plates we should be spinning. We let society tell us what's really important in life. We let our circumstances that seem to be so pressing decide what we're going to be putting our focus on. So we put things on the back burners. We try to keep them warm for when we can pull them forward when we need to. But if you hear one thing this morning, I want it to be this: never put your faith on the back burner. It's not worth it. It's not worth it to ignore God. It's not worth it to ignore your responsibility with the Scriptures and to blame it on the other things that we have going on in life. The one thing I hope you can hear from me this morning, is that idea. That if you're putting God behind in the back, you're going to forget about Him for now because there's more important things pressing right now I have to put my concentration and focus on. You're making a mistake. There is nothing more important than your relationship with God. It must be first. And when we get it back, we start putting God behind everything else, we're in a lot of trouble. That really is the point of Ecclesiastes, the whole book, really. But Ecclesiastes chapter 12, 1 through 8, which we're going to see, I want you to notice the fact that life does not get easier with age. Now, in some ways it does, because hopefully we've developed some habits. Hopefully we've actually been able to, through maturity or through, like I said before, the processes of how life works, we're not as involved in so many things sometimes. So in a way it does get better. Hopefully financially it gets a little better. Hopefully socially it gets a little better. But in a lot of ways it doesn't. In fact, what I'm learning is that you have more and more pains the older you get. I think we kind of, a lot of people agree with that one, right? And I realize that compared to some people, I'm young, and compared to some people, I'm old. So I'm kind of in the middle. I get that, but you slow down. Have you noticed that your thinking has slowed a little bit? I know mine has. You need more rest. You know, when you're a teenager, you can get by on a lot less sleep, but they say you need more because your body is still developing. And then when you become in your 20s, you can get by on less, but you need about 7 or 8 hours until you're later in life. And evidently, later in life, you need even more because it's harder and harder for you to actually get good sleep. And that's one of the ironies, that you have more time for rest, but you don't really rest that much. So life doesn't really get any easier. And that's something to recognize as we go through this. Look in Ecclesiastes chapter 12. That's what this really is. It's symbolic language, but you can see the symbolism. I'm not going to explain all the symbolism here, but it's pretty obvious as you're going through. Because of verse 1, he says, "Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come, and the years draw near when you say, 'I have no pleasure in them.'" Now, what you're going to be having no pleasure in, that quotation is talking about the years. I have no pleasure in living anymore because of all the pains and the aches and the tribulation, the trials that I'm going through. That's what he's talking about. He says, "While the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are not darkened, and the clouds do not return after the rain, in the day when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men bow down, when the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look through the windows grow dim, when the doors are shut in the streets and the sound of grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of the music are brought low. Also they are afraid of height and of terrors in the way. When the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper is a burden, and desire fails, for man goes to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets." Look at what he's saying. Just a few of the highlights here of the symbolism that's being talked about. He says, "In the day when the keepers of the house tremble, and the strong men bow down, and the grinders cease." The strong men bow down. Have you ever noticed that sometimes as people age, they start stooping a little bit more and more? That's the idea. When the grinders cease because they're few, the grinders would be your teeth. That's what happens too. We lose them. We start losing things. Those that look through the window grow dim. So your eyes start being affected. The doors are shut in the street. The sound of grinding is low. When one rises up at the sound of a bird. So you're up early because you can't sleep anymore. And all the daughters of music are brought low because you can't hear anymore. They're afraid of heights and of terrors in the way, and the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper is a burden, and desire fails. And then we go to our eternal home. This is all symbolism for the process of aging. And his point is, before all that happens, make sure you remember your Creator. And I promise you, every single person in here, you're as young as you're going to be for the rest of your life. So it applies to all of us. But it certainly should apply to people who are younger. And we are blessed to have a really good mix of ages here. And when we first got here, there was even more, but I think the average age, if you just take all the people and divide it evenly, the average age before was about 30. That's pretty young for a congregation. A lot of congregations I know, that number would be probably 70. I don't know what it is now. It's probably a little bit higher, but we have so many kids that I don't know in comparison. But whatever the age is, we all have a recognition that we have a broad range here, don't we? And we have a good mix. It's good for us to recognize that and also to encourage the younger people. Before things get difficult, and you might say, I remember reading this thing, life is already difficult. It's not going to get any better. In some ways, it's not going to get better. In some ways, you may have more time, as I've said before, but here he's saying, remember your Creator when you're young, before the difficult days come, before it gets really hard for you to be faithful to God. Remember your Creator. Now think about that for just a minute. We look at the ideas here. Maybe I can get this to go forward. Strength, talking about strength, built slowly. There are ways to build strength, to build muscle very quickly. And it tends to be that, unless you're doing steroids, which, even then, have you ever seen bodybuilders that are huge, or muscles are, 4 times bigger than my leg, and all kinds of huge muscles that they put on, and they can put it on relatively quickly, and it's all basically the way it looks. And in fact, a lot of them will admit, I really can't lift much weight. It looks like I can, but I really can't. I'm not really that strong. I've talked to some of them. Some of it was humility. They can still lift more than I can, but relatively speaking, for the way they look, it's not really necessarily the way that they could lift. Well, that's kind of the way it is in life. But I ran across some other people who have said that they ran into what they called old man strength. That is, I've run into some of those. I used to lift a lot of weights before, so this is kind of appropriate for me. But I get a little bit bulky, and I thought, okay, I'm pretty strong now. I go shake some people's hands. Have you ever shook an old man's hand that made you want to go to your knees because it squeezed you so hard? That's old man strength. And that's strength that came from years of working with his hands, working on the farm. There's all these little smaller muscles that we don't pay attention to if you're weightlifting that get strengthened over time. And over time, they become stronger and stronger. And so even into late in life, some men are very, very strong still. And it was so funny. I ran into someone that he ran into some of this old man strength because he thought he was so strong, and then he ran up against someone who was a lot older than him, was a lot stronger than him too. That's the reason, is because hard work lasts longer. There are ways to cheat, there are ways to do it quickly, but really the better is long term. And that really is what life is about too. Spiritual strength is just like that. There are no, it struck me as I was going through this, there are no steroids for spiritual growth. There's no cheat system. It's a process that takes time, and a process that we have to focus on, or it's not going to happen. We can pretend, we can present ourselves as if we got everything figured out, but we have to, over time, build those things, and it's the only way that's going to happen. It's a slow process that we all have to be engaged in, and it takes a lifetime. But have you noticed that with age is not always wisdom? I've said this many times before, and I've learned this the hard way. Just because we grow old doesn't mean that we're growing wise at the same time. In some ways, we can't help it, but in a lot of spiritual things especially, we can grow old and never get wise. We can grow old and never grow in Christ. Because it has to be something that we're focused on, and we have to be consistent with it for it to happen and develop in our lives. So this is really what he's talking about here. Before really things get difficult for you, take the time to build your spiritual life now. Don't wait. There's so many times in younger ages, and the teen years and the 20s and the 30s, everything is going great. Everything seems so easy, and you think, I've got this made. I can just work now. I can work hard. I can gain a lot of wealth. And then later on, I can worry about how I serve God. You can't do that. Because what happens is things get difficult. Things get hard. And things happen that you don't realize are going to happen. So we need to take advantage of our opportunities while we have them, while it's easier for us. I'm not saying that it's easy. I'm not saying that everything is rosy if you're younger. That's not truth at all. But it is going to be much more difficult later. In fact, it's our human nature to avoid pain. We want to push it off as far as we can, right? So we don't want to do things that are hurtful, that seem like they hurt, because we want to avoid pain. That's exactly how we are. Look in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 14, because Jesus talks about this tendency that we need to be careful, that we pay attention to the difficult things. And in fact, he says that's the only way. In chapter 7, verse 14, he says, "Narrow is the gate, and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it." Why is it that they can't find life? It's not that it's unavailable to them. It's not that God only selects a few people and say, okay, you can have it, but no one else can have it. It's because it's difficult. We don't like to do difficult things, right? It's a whole lot easier for us to find the easy way, and there are many paths in life that are easier. No question about it. But is it worth it? That's the question we have to ask. Is this path going to be worth the effort or the lack of effort? Now, please don't misunderstand either. There's no reason for us to just pick the most difficult things in life. I was having this conversation a few days ago with someone, and he was saying that he would always play video games, and he would always put it on the hardest setting because he thought it would only be worth it if he could have it on the hardest setting, and life has to be the hardest possible choices he could make. And he chose to make some pretty bad choices, and it made it really difficult for him. That's not the point. He's not saying find the most difficult way. He's saying the way to life is difficult. And you've got to be prepared for it. You've got to make the right decisions and take advantage of your opportunities while you have them in order to do what is good. If you spend your whole life avoiding pain, what's going to happen later on when it's more pain? You're going to want to avoid it even more, right? So if it's already difficult to walk in the way of truth and then walk in the way of light and follow Jesus, if it's already difficult at age 20, it's going to be more difficult at age 70 and 90. If you put it off until then, you're not going to have as much opportunity, and you're not going to have as much ability. You're not going to have as much time. You're not going to have as much wherewithal to do it. So I've seen time and time again, people seem to have this attitude that I can worry about it later. I've got too many things right now going on. It's too hard right now. Yeah. No question, not taking away from the fact that it's difficult. It's always going to be difficult. And in many ways, it's going to be more difficult later than it is now. We think about this from the perspective of, I've mentioned before, of persecution. You don't come to Christianity, we all think we come out of the water. If you ask anyone who's baptized, you say, are you willing to give your life for Jesus? I just did. I just died to myself. I was baptized. So, of course, I would give my life for Jesus. Thankfully, we don't have someone who we come out of the water, someone put a gun to our head and say, deny Jesus. Because we may not be ready to handle it yet. But is there ever a point in life where we're going to make that decision? It could be. We have to be ready for that. How do you prepare for that? You do it through time. You do it through building strength. You do it through building resolve and continuing to do things that are difficult, and we build on those things. And so many, I've mentioned this in class one time. A man asked us if we would all be willing to give our lives for Jesus. And I was in preaching school, and all of us raised our hand quickly, right? And then he said, why is it then, if you're willing to give your life, why is it so hard for you to give up sin? Talk about conviction. Oh, I'm going to do all the great things for God. I'm going to do all the great things for Jesus, but don't ask me to give up this little bitty thing for Him. Don't ask me to make things difficult for me because, I'm going to put that off till later. But we build our spiritual life over time through effort, through consistency. That's the only way it can be built. You can't magically one day wake up and say, I'm a good Christian today. You don't wake up one day and deny the Lord and reject all the things and all the opportunities to grow and develop. You don't reject all those and then one day you say, okay, I'm gonna be a strong Christian, and overnight you just wake up and now I'm a strong Christian. It doesn't work that way. If you spend your entire life denying the way to grow, denying the things that you should be doing in order to develop and grow spiritually, you can't just do it all in one day. It takes a lifetime. Now, can you still go to heaven? Sure. But you're looking at a life that you have, in essence, you are wasting if you wait until the end and then decide to, okay, I'm going to get my life right now. Not only that, there's so many things that we don't know that's coming. For example, did you know that Jesus said that we're producing fruit, that we'll have treasures in heaven based upon the things that we do now? I don't know how that's going to play out. I don't know what it's going to look like. But I do know that we can have more and more growth, more and more development of our spirit, more and more of that spiritual life that God has promised to us, the spiritual freedom that Jesus said to us, if we will continue to build, and we build that over a lifetime. It's the only way that can happen. So we also have then the recognition, the last point is that we need to make sure we do what's important. I mentioned before that we let everyone else tell us what's important. Sometimes we let our own emotions tell us what's important. We let our own feelings tell us what's important. Have you ever been there? Sure. I don't feel like. See, that's the point. We confuse spirituality with emotions. If I don't feel like doing it, that means that I shouldn't do it because I have to have my heart in it. And we tend to use that excuse sometimes. We're looking at the fact that I don't feel it, so therefore it's not going to be expected of me. But that's not true. There are a lot of times we don't feel like doing what is the right thing, but that has no bearing on whether or not we do the right thing, right? It shouldn't have any bearing, but too often it does. And we're all human. We all tend to be that way if we're not careful. So what do we have to do? We have to look at what's important in life. And we let God tell us what is important and not let everyone else tell us what's important. We get caught up in so many things. Our world has so many systems and things in place to cause us so much concern over nothing. You know, I mean, just think politically, just think monetarily, just think about all the hoops that we're supposed to jump through, all the things that we're supposed to have, all the things that supposedly represent some kind of a status that we've created for ourselves of what a good person is going to be. Think about all the money that we're supposed to gather up and hoard in different ways and different opportunities. Think about the credit system that we have where it says you have to have everything perfect and that you have to have everything, and everything has to relate to how good your credit is. You know, there's some people that believe that whether they go to heaven or not depends on whether they have over 700 in their credit score. They don't say that, but they act like it. Why? Because it's more important. You know, there's some things, I'm not saying not to pay your bills, that's not my point. But there's some things that we put in life that are so much more important to us than they are to God. Does it really matter how far you advance in your career? You know, if you never get a promotion, but you go to heaven, is that okay? What if you get promotion after promotion and don't make it to heaven? Is that okay? Obviously not. Do what is important, and don't let everyone else tell you what's important. Think of your future. The book of Ecclesiastes is really good about that. It talks about all the vanities of this life, all the things that we pursue, because we got to have goals. Doesn't this touch on the idea that we're facing today? Isn't it? It's New Year's, so we're all setting goals, right? I have a lot of goals for this year. You know what? The only thing that's important is not whether or not I hit our goals. The thing that's important is my relationship with God, whether I'm going to be in heaven with Him. The same with us, all of us. Think of what's important in your future. What's more important? Having your physical life taken care of or your spiritual life taken care of? Now, hopefully you can have both. But if you have to make a decision, what's it going to be? And you might say, well, I already know what my decision is going to be. It's going to be the spiritual. But look at the decisions that you're making. Are you making those kinds of decisions now? Is the decision you're making, are you putting as first, as more important, your relationship with God or your relationship with money or your relationship with things? The decisions that we make on a daily basis is what builds our character in the long run. So we can't come to the end of life and say, well, I've lived a life full of making bad decisions, but now I'm going to be spiritually strong overnight. It's not going to happen. We build it over time, and we build it by making decisions according to the proper priorities that God teaches us. That's the only way it can be done. So think of your future. Look in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. There's, like I said, this whole book is amazing for that. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 22 and 23. It says, What has man for all his labor and for the striving of his heart with which he has toiled under the sun? For all his days are sorrowful and his work burdensome. Even in the night his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity. We spend our lives working, toiling, laboring, worrying about the things of this world, and even at night we can't rest. Is it really worth it? Look in chapter 4 in verse 13. Better a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who will be admonished no more. You see this point there? It's better for you to be it's better for you to be poor than to be a fool. Now, in our society, and human tendency says, well, if you're a fool, you're going to be poor. We even have the saying, a fool and his money are soon parted, right? Sure, you can be a fool and lose everything. You can also be poor and be wise at the same time. Because spiritual wisdom has nothing to do with how much money you make. It's not a determinant. It doesn't mean that you're going to make money. And just because you make money doesn't mean that you're spiritually wise. But we have to do what's important in life. That's really what we're looking at. Look in 1 Peter chapter 1. This is the last idea that I want, part of this idea. 1 Peter chapter 1, 2 Peter chapter 1, the same verses would also work just as well. In verse 3, he says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his abundant mercy has begotten us again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you, who are kept by the power of God through faith for salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time." You see, we have something that should be more important than anything else, our relationship with God. We have the promise that we have an abundant inheritance in verse 4, an inheritance that is both incorruptible and undefiled, that does not fade away, that's reserved for us in heaven. That's what should be important to us. And the reason it should be important to us is not because I'm saying it should be important to us, it's because it's where our future lies. If our future doesn't lie there, what are we waiting? What are we working toward? At the end of this world, at the end of this life, what Jesus said, what profit is it to gain the whole world and lose your own soul? What will you give in exchange for your soul? If you owned every single atom of this entire universe, can you give that to God as a payment for your soul? You can't. He's the one that made it all to begin with. But if you somehow gained it all for yourself and hoarded it all up, it's not going to help you one bit in your relationship with God, because God does not judge you based upon how much you can hoard in this life or how well you do in this world. He judges you based upon your relationship with Him. And that is, do you have sin, and has He forgiven that sin? The first question is obviously yes, because all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Romans chapter 3 and verse 23. And we know from chapter 6 and verse 23 of Romans that the wages of sin is death. But God is the one who gives us life. And so, yes, while we have all the things that we can be searching for and striving for in this world, and it's so easy to get caught up in those things and think that they're actually important. But at the end of the day, when your life finally the mist has finally dissipated, your life over very quickly, and you know how it's getting faster and faster. At the end of everything, you have an eternity to reap the results of that short little life that you lived. And there is no other choice. There is no other change. Once we reach the end of this life, that will determine whether we're going to be in heaven or in hell. And there's no changing it. So this is reality. And the reality is that we must put priorities in the right place. Because at the end, when everything is said and done, it's better for us to be poor and looked at as foolish in this world and have a right relationship with God than to have everything the world says we should have and not be right with Him. But think about that. Work on what will actually last. Because when you have everything hoarded and God and Jesus comes back, if you had everything in this universe and when He comes back, it's all going to be destroyed anyway. And then what will you have? Nothing. Your relationship with God is far more important than that. So love God while it's easier, while you have opportunity. Take advantage of your youth and your vigor and put the first things first. That doesn't mean we can't do other things in life, but we have to have God first. Never put your faith, your relationship with God on the back burner. It's just not worth it. It's too dangerous. You don't know when this life is going to be over. You don't know the things that you're going to face later that you need to prepare for now. If there's any way that we can help you, please let us know. If you need to be baptized for the remission of your sins, we can do that with you. If you need to study, learn how to do that, what that's about, let's talk. Or if you're a Christian and you haven't been living the right way, maybe you've gotten things out of whack, out of priority. It's time to make things right. Sometimes it means that you need to make a public confession of public sin. If that's the case, let's help you. Or if you need just prayers. You know, the decisions that you make, there's no one in this audience, including me, that is not going to make a decision based on this sermon. You decide from today on how you're going to live. And it may be that you continue to live in the way God wants you to live. It may be that you continue to live in the way Satan wants you to live. But you get to make that decision. If there's any way we can help with that, please come as we stand and sing.